Larry Barker joins me here again in the News 13 digital studio to talk about one of your latest investigations. Larry, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, and this is regarding the city of Albuquerque and an asbestos problem that was found in the midst of construction. It is still happening to some degree there over at the Gateway Center. So, Larry, fascinating investigation. For those of you who have not watched it online yet, you can do so on KRQE.com right now. Just look out for this story here. Albuquerque's Gateway Center, the danger zone. You can see Larry's got the whole write-up of this investigation here, along with some of the historical elements as well that show all the way back to when this place was first built and what it originally looked like. And the history here obviously is a central role to this story here. So we'll get to that in just here a moment. But I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you, Larry, high level, because your story has been out here for a couple days. We'll get into the nuance of the story here in just momentarily, but I wanted to ask you, have you heard any reaction from viewers, from anybody about this story yet?
Well, sure. I mean, this is really a big deal. Asbestos is a known carcinogen, and there is no acceptable exposure to asbestos.
Right.
So if there is, if a worker is exposed to asbestos, it can and will affect their health. So this is really a big deal.
Absolutely.
And yeah, we've heard from viewers and quite a few number of folks about this, because there is definitely concern is what happened at the Gateway Center and what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's give a little bit of context here just about the Gateway Center for those who maybe blanking on a little bit of the details. I can help fill in here. It's a more than 70-year-old former Loveless Hospital. It is now called the Gateway Center by the city of Albuquerque, which basically started to the process of buying the property in December of 2020. Eventually, that deal went through sometime in 2021, and the plan basically is to turn the Gateway Center, this old hospital building, into a homeless shelter alongside other associated and related maybe medical services that might be important to the population they're serving there. So we know that the first 60 beds, the city held a news conference at the beginning of this year, basically celebrating the opening of these first 60 beds. And they had planned, basically, this has been something that the mayor has talked about numerous times over the last year, to open more beds by this summer of 2023. So there's obviously been work that has been happening inside this building over the last several months, to say the least. And your investigation exposed what happened surrounding some of that work. So let's start with this. How and why did you start working on this story?
Well, we were approached by individuals who had knowledge of the construction that's going on at the building, and they did present us with a number of internal city documents which talked about the construction work that was done over the last year and the presence of asbestos in those work areas. Okay. But to answer your question, is we were approached by individuals who had firsthand knowledge of what's going on at the Gateway Center.
Yeah. And so I know you laid this out in your story. Asbestos was a very commonly used material throughout the 50s when this building was built. And I think some people might watch this story and they might say, didn't the city know that? I mean, that's a commonly known thing. You don't even have to be in the building trade to know that asbestos is common in old buildings. I remember it was in my middle school. Why, people might ask, why would construction then keep going if perhaps you even suspected it might be there? But you mentioned in your story there was really, it sounds like, no testing that was done before the work just kept going.
Well, put this in context.
Okay.
The old Loveless Hospital building was built in 1950.
Yeah.
And back then, in the 50s and 60s, it was very common to use asbestos because it is very durable, it's fireproof, so it was used in a lot of building materials very commonly.
Yeah.
And back then, nobody realized that asbestos can be quite harmful. Right. So it was really common. In old buildings, there is likelihood, commercial buildings, especially like hospitals, it is very common to find asbestos in those building materials. Now, just, I say in building materials, things like insulation, in ceiling tiles, floor tiles.
Right.
Now, just the fact that those materials have asbestos doesn't mean that they are hazardous. They're embedded in these materials. If you disturb them, if you tear them apart or scrape them out, then asbestos can become airborne, and that's when asbestos becomes very dangerous. Mm-hmm. So just because it's in a floor tile doesn't make it hazardous. It's when you rip out the floor tiles that federal regulations come into play. So the city bought this building in 2021, and before they bought it, of course there was extensive environmental surveys of the building to see what the state of the building was. And they knew at that time that this building did contain some asbestos materials like floor tiles, ceiling tiles, insulation.
Yeah.
Now, you got to understand, this is a big building.
Right.
It is 500,000 square feet. Huge. So they did surveys in certain parts of the area to find is there asbestos, and in certain parts, for example, in the basement, they found that there was asbestos materials. It was properly removed, but the area that was under construction the last year, which is on the second floor in the western wing of the building, that area had not been surveyed. Mm. So they really didn't know for sure whether there was asbestos or not. Mm. Now, anytime you deal with a 70-year-old building, you got to assume that there are going to be asbestos throughout the building.
Right.
That didn't happen on the second floor where the current renovation is taking place. That's a problem. It wasn't surveyed. They didn't know whether there was asbestos or not. You can assume it anytime you're dealing with a 1950 built building. There's going to be asbestos. Yeah. But that was the city's fault for not doing the survey, and that's what they were. That's really a subject of this current OSHA investigation. Is why didn't the city survey the area before they did the demolition and the renovation?
Yeah, it is just, the question that I'm left with, well, if you had an idea, why wouldn't you test it before construction? But it sounds like that's what OSHA is trying to get to the bottom of. What is next for OSHA? I know that they've made at least some level of a report. You mentioned that in your story as well, but I assume their work is not done. What is next for OSHA?
The OSHA is engaged in a fairly significant investigation as to what happened, what was the extent of the renovation, and what asbestos materials were improperly removed. The investigation is going to take several months. There were some findings based on interviews with contractors and employees who were in the building. And there were some findings, but the investigation is ongoing. But the OSHA did find that Albuquerque and its contractor did improperly work in an area where there was asbestos materials and did improperly failing to comply with federal regulations about asbestos, they did improperly remove the asbestos materials.
Yeah. You reached out, obviously, to a lot of the parties involved here, to include the city. I know that's a matter discussed in your story. But, as noted, you really didn't get any responses from the key players involved, to include Mayor Tim Keller's office. And so did you ever hear any type of explanation from anybody about why they wouldn't want to address this?
That's... Chris, it's really kind of odd here, but this is a huge deal. This is a major initiative of the current administration, this homeless shelter, soon to be homeless shelter. So when there's a problem with the city and complying with federal health and safety regulations, you would expect some kind of accountability, openness about what's happened. And we couldn't even get the city, anybody in the city, to even respond to our phone calls. We called the project manager, he did not respond. We called the General Service Department director, he did not answer our phone calls. And we requested an interview with the mayor himself, and there was no response to our request.
Wow.
So why did they do what they did? We don't know, and the city's not saying.
Interesting. So obviously you did speak to at least one concerned member of the city here. City Councilor Dan Lewis was interviewed in your story. And, we also keep in mind context, right? Dan Lewis did run against Mayor Tim Keller for mayor, back in 2017, I think it was, but obviously reelected to the council sometime more recently and has raised his concerns with this. But I guess I wanted to ask you, would you anticipate City Council taking this any further? I know in every City Council meeting, right, they have these administrative question and answer periods. That sometimes is where we hear some of that discussion about just random concerns, right, these councilors may have about things happening in the city. So do you expect this to go further with City Council?
Well, I expect that there will probably be questions about what happened and how it happened. And what the consequences will be. I think there are two significant investigations going on, and until we get the results of the two investigations, I don't anticipate a lot of action on this issue.
Gotcha.
There is the state investigation, the state OSHA investigation. This is ongoing. It's going to be a while before we have the report. There will be a report. There may be citations. There may be violations. If there are violations found, the fines can be significant. Potentially it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. We don't know. We just have to wait. There is a second investigation. This is a city investigation. The Office of the City's Inspector General, which is an independent investigative arm of the city, is also doing an investigation. We don't have their report yet. It is expected sometime soon. But I think until we see the results of the official investigations, we're not going to really get much of an explanation as to exactly what happened and why it happened and what the consequences will be.
Yeah, but obviously we know politics are at play as well here, and that was not only mentioned, I believe, in one of the documents included in your investigation, this idea of political motivations potentially being wrapped up in this, but it is obviously a cornerstone project of the administrations over the last several years.
And really, Chris, this is not a political issue.
Right. It's a health and safety issue.
There are people who use this to their political advantage, but we are talking about federal health and safety regulations and the city's compliance with those regulations. The city has acknowledged in news releases that it failed to properly remediate asbestos. These are governed by federal regulations, and the state and feds are investigating why they did it.
Yeah,
we don't know.
That's a big question. Yeah, well,
maybe we'll find out.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate you putting this story together. I think there's probably a lot of other folks that do as well. If folks have a tip for you or maybe some more information to share about this story, how can they reach you?
They can always reach us through the KRQE website. We always want to hear from viewers. This story came as a result of a tip to us. So we really appreciate our viewers out there, and if they see something that needs to come to our attention, they can reach us through the website.
Okay. Larry Barker, thanks again for joining us here.
Thank you, Chris.